It's a very great pleasure to be, sadly only virtually, in the company of my good friends of the BSA and of all of you who have tuned in to listen to this. I was thinking somewhat wistfully as I was preparing for this, that in the real world, if we'd been able to do it, we would have been in one of those splendid rooms upstairs in the house in Carlton Terrace in London, which belonged once upon a time to that great Philhellene, William Ewart Gladstone. And as I was speaking, you might have heard the discreet sound of chinking of glasses and preparations going on outside the room for a reception, which would have enabled us to meet and talk and have a welcome drink after the intellectual business was over. Well, the virtual world we're all having to get used to. Let's hope not for too much longer. But it does, as John says, bring us this new, rather wonderful possibility that I can speak to you here in my study at home in Whitstable on the north coast of Kent in England. And I don't know where you all are, but it's great that you're listening. So, from the Europe of empires to the Europe of nation states. And I'd like to start by taking a very long view. These are things that we know, but let's just remind ourselves very briefly, and I hope you'll bear with me as I run through a few fairly well-known landmarks in world history over a little bit more than 200 years. In July 1776, on the far side of the Atlantic, the American Declaration of Independence sets out what it calls the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and that they enjoy inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then in 1789, also in the month of July, the storming of the Bastille prison in Paris sparks off the train of events that we now know as the French Revolution, under the slogan Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The turn of the 19th century is often known as the Age of Revolutions. The Industrial Revolution, perhaps making a third alongside those two, or sometimes the Romantic movement in the arts is considered as itself another revolution. Framing that, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815 turned the whole of Europe upside down and involved the far side of the Atlantic as well, both the South and North and South America. As the initial impetus of the French Revolution turns into something else, once Napoleon declares himself emperor and sets out on the conquest of Europe. After the defeat of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna, for more than a year in 1814 to 1815, draws up a blueprint for what was called the Concert of Europe, according to which European powers would cooperate thereafter to maintain a status quo such that the events of 1789 to 1815 could never be repeated. 1811 to 1825, that's the period of the South American wars of independence and decolonization against the colonial powers of Spain and Portugal. 1848, back in Europe, often called the Year of Revolutions, mostly in the short term abortive revolutions, but they led to wholesale change that affected the entire continent, most famously the unifications of the major new nation states of the old world, Italy and Germany, during the 1860s. Between 1878 and 1913, all the states of the Balkan Peninsula are recognized again as sovereign, as independent. After the end of the First World War in 1918, the immediate effect is to dissolve the defeated empires, Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire, of course, has already gone the same way after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And a whole raft of new states are created to replace them. After the Second World War, similarly, an era of decolonization sees the creation of countless new nation states, this time not only or not primarily in Europe, but rather throughout the rest of the world. And in the 1990s, on a smaller scale, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia led to civil war and the creation of the most recent states to emerge on the European landmass. So it's a process that's still going on. And let's not forget, finally, that the growing movement of nationalism or separatism in some parts of Europe today, while tensions are rising between nationalist or populist movements on the one hand, and, for example, the supranational institutions of the European Union, could that perhaps be today's answer to the Concert of Europe, on the other. A familiar story? Well, of course, and it's very broad brush. But I've left out, and you've noticed me doing it, I've left out the very bit that you're all tuned in to hear about. What about 1821? What about the Greek Revolution? That's rather my point. Because the broad brush story, at least as it's told in English, either leaves out the Greek Revolution altogether, or really doesn't know what to do with it. Two influential and highly regarded studies of the growth of modern nationalism, published in the 1990s, one by Eric Hobsbawm, the other by John Bruley, explicitly doubted whether the Greek Revolution was even a national liberal revolution at all. Others sidestep the issue rather awkwardly or treat Greece as a special case, sort of somewhere out there in the Balkans. And that, of course, is what, for different reasons, Greek histories most often do too. Greece was different, the story goes. Greeks had, after all, formed a nation since ancient times, and the struggles of the 1820s, according to that way of presenting the story, were all about restoring that nation to its former rightful condition. At the time and since, Greek independence was regularly referred to as a revival or regeneration, even resurrection of ancient Greece. I hope you don't find that slide too irreverent, but I loved this antique shop that I drove past a few years ago on the road from Corinth to Nafplio, which it seemed to me rather wonderfully, and in the spirit of free enterprise, presents a palimpsest of all of Greek history from the perspective of today. Exceptionalism, the idea that your own nation is different from every other, isn't unique to Greece and Greeks. Far from it. That's actually the rather paradoxical thing about exceptionalism. Everybody does it. But when you put these two perspectives together, on the one hand, the broad brush European, and on the other, the traditional Greek exceptionalist view, it's the resurrection of ancient Greece, you find that extraordinarily, between them, they've managed to eclipse what I believe is the true significance of 1821. First of all, in the context of the longue durée of Greek history, it wasn't a restoration at all, because there wasn't anything remotely like it to restore. The Greek nation state that we know and love today was created out of the revolution of the 1820s, and it's like nothing that existed in either the ancient or the medieval world. The ancient Greeks, with their fixation on what they called the autonomia, the autonomy of self-governing, mostly small city-states, never managed to make that leap. The Byzantine state, for all its fabled wealth, power, and geographical reach, was something else again, and certainly never chose to define itself as Hellas or its people as Hellenes, as Greeks have done since 1821. The nation state that became a reality during the 1820s and the 1830s was every bit as much of a novelty for Greeks, even if you accept the argument of Greek exceptionalism, as it was for the rest of the European continent at the time. But when you look at it against the broad sweep of modern history that I started with, that novelty is all the more striking. And it reaches far beyond the narrow boundaries of the independent Greek state, either in the 1830s or even the rather expanded boundaries as they are today. The key date and the key event is one that is often overlooked or downplayed, even sometimes in histories of the revolution. The decisive moment came on the 3rd of February 1830. It happened not on the battlefield or even in Greece at all, but in a dry conclave of dignitaries held at the British Foreign Office on Whitehall, only a stone's throw from the British Academy, where notionally we must imagine ourselves sitting today. On that day, the foreign ministers of Great Britain, France, and Russia signed a document that declared, for the first time, I translate, Greece will form an independent state and will enjoy all those rights, political, administrative, and commercial, attached to complete independence. Greece, Hellas or Hellas in Greek, was born at that moment and took its place on the political map of Europe. The revolution wasn't yet over by any means. It would take another 2 years after that for all the details to be worked out, including frontiers and the system of government to be applied. But that date in February 1830 marks the turning point. What this means is that the Greek Revolution of the 1820s was the first liberal national movement to succeed in the old world, after the United States, in tandem with similar movements in South America, and before every one of the more familiar national unifications or wars of independence on the continent or near the continent of Europe. The ideological groundwork had been laid mostly by thinkers writing in French and German during the century before. Don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that Greeks or Greece invented the nation state. But it was in Greece, that the experiment was first put into practice in Europe. The dates on the slide, and they're not a full list, say it all. The outcome of the Greek Revolution was the pivotal point on which the whole geopolitical map of Europe tilted from the 18th century model of multi-ethnic, autocratically ruled empires to the 20th century model of the self-determination of nation states. Well, that's really the pitch I'm making in this talk, and I've really, so far, really spelt out what was implied in shorthand form in the title. But now, let's consider, how did this come about? What was it about events in Greece, about the dynamics or the ideologies of the conflict, that made this outcome possible? The short answer, I believe, is that right from the beginning, the Greek uprising was more than a local affair. Broader interests and broader perspectives were involved, as well as the very real grievances and, once the killing had begun, the urgent need of people on the ground to save their lives and what they could of their livelihoods. From that point of view, it's instructive to compare the Greek revolt with events in Serbia in 1804 and again in 1815. With hindsight, the Serbian uprisings had been claimed as a national or nationalist struggle too. And it's true that eventually their consequences would morph into one. But even when a degree of autonomy was granted to Serbia, the conflict had little, in 1817, so that's before Greece, the conflict had little resonance outside the borders of the Ottoman Empire. It changed neither the external frontiers nor fundamentally the internal workings of the Ottoman Empire itself. Serbia didn't gain independence until 1878, a full half century after Greece. I suggest that the reason for that is that the Serbs fought alone, the Greeks did not. So for the rest of this talk, I want to focus on the international dimension of the Greek Revolution, which I argue is the key to understanding its remarkable and long-lasting outcome. It began on the night of 5th to 6th March 1821, or 21st to 22nd February, according to the calendar in use in southeastern Europe at the time, and confusingly for Western historians, still used in history books written in Greek about this period. A one-armed senior officer in the Russian imperial service slipped across the river Prut, there he is doing it on the left of the screen, with a handful of retainers from what was then Russian territory into Ottoman-controlled Moldavia. Like many high-ranking Russians in those days, his native language was Greek. He'd been born and brought up as a Greek. His name, familiar to many people listening, I'm sure, was Alexandros Ypsilandis, and he was the leader of a conspiracy known as the Filiki Eteria, or Friendly Society. The society had been secretly recruiting members for a number of years among the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire and further afield in Europe. 2 days after crossing the river into Ottoman territory, Ypsilandis issued a proclamation headed Mahou hyperpistios ke patridos, fight for faith and fatherland. And it begins, I translate what you can read in Greek on the screen. The hour has come, O men of Hellas, the enlightened peoples of Europe, full of gratitude for the benefits bequeathed by our ancestors to themselves, eagerly await the liberty of the Hellenes. Just a month after that, more as the opposite end of the Greek-speaking world, in Kalamata, near the southern tip of the Peloponnese, a document called the Manifesto addressed to Europe by Petros Mavromichalis, commander-in-chief of the Spartan troops and the Messenian Senate, announced that, I quote selectively from what's on your screen, the unhappy Greeks of Peloponnesus have taken up arms against the insupportable yoke of the Ottoman tyranny. And he went on, it's the middle part of the extract. We invoke the aid of all the civilized nations of Europe, that we may the more promptly attain to the goal of a just and sacred enterprise, reconquer our rights, and regenerate our unfortunate people. Notice that word regeneration that I quoted again in a different context earlier. He goes on, Greece, our mother, was the lamp that illuminated you. On this ground, she reckons on your active philanthropy. Europeans are being invited to take a hand. During March and April 1821, all of the Danubian principalities, most of what is now mainland Greece, from Thessalonica in the north to the southern Peloponnese, and many towns and islands across the Aegean, rose up in response to these calls. Nothing on such a scale had happened in the Ottoman Empire before. Even so, during the first months, fearsome Ottoman reprisals came close to stamping out the revolt in its infancy. In Moldavia and Wallachia, despite initial successes, the thousands of Greek and other Balkan volunteers who had rallied behind Ypsilandis were routed by a rather smaller Ottoman army in June 1821. Ypsilandis himself rather ignominiously sought refuge in Austrian territory, where he was interned for the remainder of his rather short life. Many of his supporters fought on to the death or were captured and executed. Further south in Macedonia, in Thessaly, and on the seaboard of Anatolia, Asia Minor, the revolt was ruthlessly and successfully suppressed. Despite ambitious plans that had been laid by the Friendly Society, there was no outbreak in the capital. But that fact did not save the Phanariot, Greek-speaking aristocracy, from near annihilation in a vicious and disproportionate series of Ottoman reprisals. But there was one part of the Greek-speaking world where the revolution had well and truly taken hold. This was the Peloponnese. The often told story represented in this famous painting that the standard of revolt was raised by the Bishop of Old Patras, Germanos, at the monastery of Agia Lavra, above the town of Kalavrita, on the day of the Christian festival of the Annunciation, 25th March, is almost certainly apocryphal. But once violence had broken out all over the peninsula in early April or late March, according to the calendar in use there at the time, there was no going back. Local leaders, backed by former brigands and irregular bands of their armed followers, seized the initiative and swept across the country. Those Muslims who survived the onslaught took refuge alongside the Ottoman garrisons that remained in the larger towns and in a series of strongholds that had been built in the time of Crusaders or Venetians. From the Peloponnese, the action soon spread to some of the nearby islands, notably Hydra and Spetses just off the northeast coast, and Psara near Chios on the other side of the Aegean. Among them, these three small islands boasted the lion's share of all Greek-owned shipping at the time. Armed Greek merchantmen began to achieve successes against the Ottoman navy and were greatly feared. Other larger islands joined in, including Samos and Crete, though many did not. At the end of the year, a first National Assembly brought together representatives from all the areas that had been liberated to draw up a constitution. For the first time, it was formally stated that a new political state was to be known by the ancient name of Hellas and its citizens as Hellenes. That's the key passage I've ringed in red, as the writing is rather small. Prosorinon Politevmatis Elados, the provisional constitution of Hellas. So effective has that collective act of reinvention been that it requires an effort of imagination today to realize just how innovative it was at the time. Many Greeks would still continue to think of themselves as Romans, Romi, in everyday context and informally among themselves for at least a century and a half after that. But the official designations, revived from the ancient world and adapted to the new political reality that was just then being shaped, have never since even been questioned. So effective was that act of formal and official reinvention. It was one thing to talk of national assemblies, political rights, and the separation of powers, which that document goes on to do, based in much detail on both the American Constitution and on a couple of the revolutionary constitutions of France. But the realities of liberation on the ground took a rather different form. They looked different to most of the rank and file whose actions were achieving it. The majority of those who took arms did so in the name of their Orthodox Christian faith. This rather wonderful banner comes from the island of Hydra. You can see the name of the island spelled out on either side of the anchor, which accompanies the cross, and very appropriately is the kind of hallmark of an island of, as it then was, ship owners and merchants. The slogan, the banner, Eleftheria y Thanatos, freedom or death, liberty or death. At grassroots level, the enemy was identified by the religion. The people called Turks, Turki, or in most cases, in fact, Muslim Albanians, rather than ethnic Turks or even official representatives of the Ottoman Empire at all, of which there weren't that many in, say, in the Peloponnese at this time. So at grassroots level, it was about religion. And the new talk of Hellenes, of Hellas, the heroes of Marathon and Thermopylae, had yet to filter through to villagers or even chieftains who had never learned to read. When it did, it would remain only a thin veneer for some time. The most popular slogan under which people fought was the one you see in front of you. But liberty, once it began to be achieved, meant rather different things to, on the one hand, the architects of that first constitution, and on the other, to the warlords who now vied with one another and with the official provisional government to impose their will upon the local areas they had liberated. During a relative lull on the external front in 1823 and 1824, the Greek Revolution faced its first political test. This was a conflict not just between individuals, and I've shown you two of the most influential ones at that stage, but between whole concepts of what liberty was going to mean for Greeks ever after that. Civil war broke out on two separate occasions for several months during 1824. On both occasions, government forces represented by but not led by the man on the right, Alexandros Mavrokordatos, came out on top. On both occasions, the decisive consequences were to reinforce the constitutional government, constitutional mechanisms, and the internationalization of the struggle, on which much more in what follows. But part of what was at stake in the antiparathysia, the contretemps, the confrontation between these two individuals and the ideas they represented, part of what was at stake there was the very issue of whether to internationalize our struggle with continuing appeals to foreigners for military, financial, and diplomatic support, or to go it alone. Victory went to those we call modernizers or constitutionalists on the right of the screen, and against the warlords such as Kolokotronis, who resented the check to their own authority that the involvement of outsiders was likely to bring. But it's worth also noticing just how differently these two parataxis or factions are remembered today. Mavrokordatos, the statesman, the constitutionalist, and to a large extent the architect of that first constitution, you see him there as the elder statesman. He lived to a ripe old age in a little visited oil painting in the Benaki. Kolokotronis sporting his helmet, which is exhibited inside the old Parliament building behind him in that, on the right of the screen, there riding on his horse. And as some of you will have seen, an opinion poll that was published a few months ago asked Greeks, I think people in Greece today, what names they associated most forcefully, the most important figures in the Greek Revolution. 97% named Kolokotronis first, 3% named the statesman Mavrokordatos. So from the end of 1824 onwards, thanks to the victory of Mavrokordatos and others, the Greek leadership was firmly focused on widening the conflict beyond Greece and bringing the great powers of Europe into the conflict. But the internal split that came to the surface between these two individuals, what they represented and the kind of mentalities behind them, that split, I would argue, has never gone away either, and indeed has since resurfaced as a fault line in many different later crises in Greek history. By this time, and we're now talking 1824, 1825, events in Greece were beginning to make an impact abroad. Those first appeals to Europe fell, as you might have expected, given the political conditions of the time, on deaf ears. But if governments still shunned the insurgents, the same couldn't be said for individuals and pressure groups that spontaneously formed in many countries. Volunteers came from every corner of the European continent. Apologies, I suppose I should apologize for the perhaps Anglo-centric line-up there. Lord Byron, the most famous of them all, Samuel Gridley Howe from Boston, Massachusetts, Richard Church from the UK, Charles Favier from France, Frank Abney Hastings, an Englishman, Thomas Lord Cochrane, a Scot. They came from every corner of the European continent and from as far away as the United States. They were known as Philhellenes, lovers of things Greek. And a high proportion of them died in Greece, whether in action like Byron in April 1824 or from disease. Often these volunteers had to evade the surveillance of their own governments, which did their best to try to stop them from going. Altogether, about 1,200 active volunteers such as these arrived in Greece between 1821 and 1827. But far more numerous, and in the end, I believe a great deal more influential on the outcome of the revolution, were those Philhellenes who stayed at home to organize committees, pressure groups, press campaigns in their own countries to lobby governments and to raise funds in aid of the Greek cause. It was very much as a result of these activities that governments abroad, and usually rather reluctantly, began to reassess their position towards Greece. Great Britain was the first to break ranks among the concert of Europe. Early in 1823, George Canning, who had recently been appointed Foreign Secretary, gave formal recognition to the captains and crews of Greek ships on the high seas as legitimate belligerent. Up till that time, and by other maritime powers, they were regarded as pirates and could be summarily shot as sunk or their crews hanged. At the end of the same year, in the USA, President James Monroe came very close to recognizing Greek independence in a famous speech to Congress. That speech is mainly remembered today for setting out the respective spheres of Europe and the New World for the rest of the century, the so-called Monroe Doctrine. But that presidential address of 2nd December 1823 also included these words: "There is good cause to believe that Greece will become again an independent nation. That she may obtain that rank is the object of our most ardent wishes." And a little over a year after that, a bill was introduced into Congress, which, if it had passed, would explicitly have had the same effect. And even though the bill failed, public support in America remained strong enough to allow the fighting frigate Hellas to be built in a New York shipyard and delivered to the Greek government at the end of 1826. In the end, though, and somewhat ironically, it was actually the conservative powers of old Europe that officially recognized Greek independence first, and the United States was a little behind in following on the initiative of Monroe back in 1823. In Europe, in the 1820s, no government was prepared to go that far. In 1824, Tsar Alexander of Russia secretly sounded out the British and French about carving out what he called zones of influence for each of them in an autonomous Greece, the point being that Greece would remain formally still subject to the Ottoman Empire. The Tsar's proposal then was leaked. The Greek leadership, there were many things they disagreed on, but just about everybody was horrified at that. They saw it as being sold down the river, and they turned instead to Great Britain. The British government in 1825 refused a formal request to take the insurgents under their protection. And rival Greek factions at the same time, shortly afterwards, put out alternative feelers to both France and Russia. But the effect of going international, seeking foreign protection, meant that Greece was now firmly and inescapably on the agenda of at least the chief maritime powers of the day. From the point of view of the Greeks, this development came not a moment too soon. By the time that plea was issued on the 1st of August 1825, the Ottoman counterattack had begun in a big way. Ottoman land forces had from the north were matched by a newly modernized fleet from Alexandria, commanded by Ibrahim Pasha, the son of the Sultan's vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, whom you see on the left there. Ibrahim landed on the south coast of the Peloponnese in February 1825. And over the next 2.5 years, the Ottoman army on land and the Egyptian and Ottoman fleets combined between them by sea succeeded in reversing pretty well everything that the Greeks had gained since 1821. With apologies to Malcolm Wagstaff, whom I should have acknowledged on the slide you see there as the source for that invaluable map that shows the direction and dates of the respective campaigns. So by the early summer of 1827, liberated Hellas had all but disappeared. Still, by that time, too many Greeks had struggled for too long to think of going back. Ibrahim, who had been promised the Peloponnese as reward for success, was threatening to kill or to enslave the remaining population and to people the entire region with Muslims shipped over from North Africa. It wasn't just Greeks who were galvanized by these threats. Philhellenes throughout the world, and I don't by that just mean the active volunteers on the ground, Philhellenes throughout the world were horrified. They were mobilized by the conviction that this wasn't just a distant squabble in a foreign land. This was a threat to something in which they all had a stake. This was a threat to Greece, in which all modern Europeans had a stake as well. By this time, it was becoming more and more difficult for governments to ignore these pressure groups coming from below. And this at a time when the fate of Greece was increasingly becoming a matter of hard-headed geopolitics at the same time. From the spring of 1826, the three great powers that had interests in the Eastern Mediterranean, namely Great Britain, France, and Russia, had embarked on a series of delicate negotiations, not with the Greeks and not with the Ottomans, but with each other. If Ottoman power was going to be seriously weakened in Europe, it mattered a great deal to the statesmen of each of these powers that neither of the others should gain a geopolitical advantage from the outcome. This was a diplomatic dilemma and Rubik's Cube that would shortly become known as the Eastern Question. The Eastern Question, of course, wouldn't be finally resolved until after the end of the First World War. But back in 1827, the three powers agreed to send a joint naval task force into the Aegean, charged with enforcing a truce between the belligerents. But the three naval detachments from Britain, France, and Russia, their respective admirals were told that was what they were told to do. Their orders didn't include any advice or instruction on how to do it. Not surprisingly, the Greeks were overjoyed at this intervention in their affairs. They welcomed sign of military intervention and were willing to accept the terms of the great powers. For equally predictable reasons, the Ottomans absolutely repudiated any involvement by outside powers in what they regarded as an entirely domestic dispute. The unintended consequence was a naval engagement in Navarino Bay off the southwest coast of the Peloponnese on the 20th of October, 1827. The combined Ottoman and Egyptian fleets were all but destroyed, and Ibrahim was forced to abandon the Peloponnese shortly afterwards. The success of the Greek Revolution in some form was now assured. But another consequence of the Battle of Navarino was that the means or the form of the eventual settlement was actually taken out of Greek hands. Now it was up to the Greek powers to find a resolution. And that would take some time yet. It was the provisional government of Greece, and not any external agent, that appointed an interim head of government for Greece, for a state that still had no formally recognized existence. His name was Ioannis Kapodistrias, also known as John Kapodistria. He was originally an aristocrat from Corfu. Later, like Ypsilantis, he had joined the Russian service and had risen to become the joint foreign minister of Russia under Tsar Alexander from 1814 to 1822. He'd long severed his relationship with the Tsars and the Russian government before he accepted the governorship of Greece in 1827. He arrived in 1828 in the Peloponnese with the title of Kyvernitis, a word which exactly translates the Latin-derived term governor. Kapodistrias was at once an outsider, he'd never been to mainland Greece before, and a Greek. And the choice of Kapodistrias as the first head of state and head of government was accepted by the great powers, who by this time had taken charge of the negotiations for Greece's future. Though for different reasons, each of the three distrusted Kapodistrias almost equally. Even the Russians, while the other two thought he was actually in their pay. But at least from the point of view of the diplomats of the great powers, they were dealing with a statesman whose credentials were widely recognized. Kapodistrias had, after all, helped to represent Russia at the Congress of Vienna. People knew him, he had name recognition. And the appointment of Kapodistrias was yet another significant step along the way towards the emergence of Greece onto the European stage. The new governor set about establishing the institutions of the future nation state and did his best to negotiate the most favorable terms that he could for Greece with the representatives of the three great powers. But the decisive breakthrough that February day in 1830 seems to have been due not to Kapodistrias, but rather to the defeat of the Ottoman Empire by Russia the previous autumn. Even the Duke of Wellington, at the time Prime Minister of Britain, and no friend to revolutions in general, still less to Greeks in particular, even the Duke of Wellington, in the autumn of 1829, after the Treaty of Adrianople, suddenly saw the geopolitical advantage to Britain and also to France of an independent Greece as a counterweight to Russia in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the protocol came to be signed on the 3rd of February, 1830. In October 1831, Kapodistrias was assassinated by two political opponents as he was entering church in Nafplio. The great powers had already decided that the new state must be a monarchy, and Kapodistrias' appointment, even had he lived, was for a fixed term. So they decided by 1832 it had to be a monarchy and not a republic, as the several provisional constitutions had laid down. The future king was named as Prince Otto, second son of the Philhellene, King Ludwig of Bavaria. A tactful geopolitical choice, because Bavaria, having no coastline, had no geopolitical interest to compete with that of the powers who were arranging these matters. The frontiers for the new kingdom, which had been under dispute since the arrival of Kapodistrias, frontiers were finally determined at the same time, and these included only the southern half of the Greek mainland as it is today, together with those islands closest to it in the Aegean, not of course the Ionian Islands, which were a British protectorate at this time. Neither the Greeks nor the Ottomans had any say in these decisions. And at the time, and for long afterwards, even today, many Greeks have felt sore at this outcome. What had been won this rather garish map from Wikipedia does conveniently show the dates at which territory was added to the Greek state, but the green doesn't sufficiently clearly show, it seems to me, the rather small extent of what was agreed in 1832. So I've livened it up for you with highlight pencil. Was this perhaps something short of the absolute ideal of liberty or death, eleftheria y thanatos, that so many had fought and died for? On the other hand, the revolution had begun with those appeals to the conscience of Europe. And if the outcome had little to do with conscience and everything to do with geopolitical calculation, it also firmly integrated the newly independent state into the evolving geopolitics of the continent and indeed of the wider world. This was how Greece, Hellas, came to take its place among the political states of Europe. The future king, Prince Otto, arrived at Nafplio aboard a British warship on the 6th of February 1833 to a rapturous reception on the shore, while the ships gathered from many nations had gathered in the bay and fired off their guns in salute. You can see the smoke rising from the cannon in the background in that rather wonderful painting, which you can see today in the Neue Pinakothek in Munich. That event marked a double first. The first Greek state in all the long history of the Greeks, and the first new nation state to follow the example of the Americas and win recognition in the old world of Europe, which I hope you'll agree brings us full circle to where we began, and my title and that rather broad brush resume of the background events in which I would argue these events, the Greek Revolution and its aftermath, deserve to take a much higher profile than they do in any general history that I've read so far. That's what I had to say so far. So I return you to the virtual British Academy and to John at the British School, who I hope will be able to hold the ring if you have lots of challenging questions that you'd like me to try and answer. But as far as the presentation goes, that's it. Thank you for listening. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την ακρόαση.